My name is Elara Vance. For 29 years, I believed love was something you earned through silence. In my family, the Vances of coastal Maine, silence wasn't just a virtue, it was currency. If you were quiet, you were obedient. If you were obedient, you were safe. But there is a thin, jagged line between being safe and being erased. I didn't realize I had crossed it until my 30th birthday dinner. Picture the scene. We were at the Ledger, the kind of restaurant where the menus don't have prices and the waiters move like ghosts. My father, Judge Silas Vance, sat at the head of a table draped in white linen. To his right was my brother, Julian, the golden son, the Harvard law grad, the man who had never felt the sting of a cold shoulder in his life. Around them sat 30 of the most powerful people in the state, governors, judges, and partners at firms that owned half the skyline. I stood up to give a toast. I wanted to thank them for coming, maybe offer a small observation about the architecture of the city I had spent my life designing in the shadows. But before I could get the first word out, my father's crystal glass hit the table. The sound wasn't loud, but it was absolute. It was a gavel. The room went tomb quiet. My father didn't look at me, he looked at the guest of honor across from him. He smiled, that practiced, judicial smile. Elara has always been our creative soul, he said, his baritone filling the room like a physical weight. But creativity without discipline is just chaos. And as she enters her 4th decade, it's clear that chaos is a luxury we can no longer afford to subsidize. He turned his eyes to me then. They were the color of the Atlantic in November, gray, cold, and deep enough to drown in. As of tomorrow morning, he continued, Elara is being placed on a restrictive allowance. Her accounts will be managed by Julian. It's for her own protection, really. She lacks the fiduciary backbone required for the Vance legacy. The room didn't gasp. They didn't protest. They laughed. It started with Julian, a soft, condescending chuckle, and spread like a virus until 30 of the most influential people in my world were laughing at me like I was a child. My face burned so hot I could feel my pulse in my teeth. I looked at my mother, sitting beside him, and saw her staring at her salad as if the lettuce held the secrets of the universe. She said nothing. I felt small. I felt like the 480-square-foot studio apartment I lived in. I felt like the pilled wool coat I had checked at the door. But then, something snapped. A wire that had been pulled taut for 3 decades finally gave way. I didn't scream. I didn't throw my wine. I looked my father dead in the eye, and in a voice so calm it sounded like it belonged to someone else, I said one word, understood. I left before the dessert course. I drove back to my apartment with the heater off, the Maine wind whistling through the seal of my old car. I spent the night packing. Not into suitcases, I didn't have time for that. I packed my life into heavy-duty trash bags. I stripped the bed. I took the sketches off my drafting table. The next morning, at exactly 7:00 a.m., my father's black SUV pulled up to the curb. I watched from the window as he climbed the stairs. He didn't knock, he used the spare key he'd forced me to give him years ago. He walked into the center of the room, already preparing the speech about how this tough love was the best thing for me. I'm glad to see you've finally learned your place, Elara, he said, not even looking at me yet. Then he saw it. The empty walls. The bare mattress. The absence of a daughter. There were no clothes in the closet, no books on the shelves, no me. I was standing by the door, car keys in my hand and a single manila folder under my arm. Before he could dial Julian's number to demand an explanation, the doorbell rang. Standing on the landing was a man I hadn't seen in years, holding a briefcase full of documents my father never knew existed. As the color began to drain from Judge Silas Vance's face, I realized that the dinner wasn't the end of my story. It was the opening statement for the defense. To understand how I ended up watching my father crumble, we have to go back. We have to go back to a rainy Tuesday in September, 3 months before that birthday dinner. The morning the first domino fell. I was at my drafting table, sketching a rain garden for a library project, when the phone rang at 6:14 a.m. The light was just beginning to turn the color of a bruise over the harbor. It was my mother. Her voice was thin, like tissue paper held up to a light bulb. "It's Grandma Beatrice," she whispered. "She's gone, Elara." Beatrice Vance was 87 years old, and she was the only person in that family who didn't speak in legal jargon. She was a woman of soil and blueprints, the one who had built the Vance estate, the rookery, with her own inheritance. She was my only ally. And now, she was gone. I drove to the hospital in a silence so thick it felt like I was underwater. When I arrived, the Vance United Front was already in the corridor. My father was leaning against the wall, his phone pressed to his ear. He wasn't crying. He was discussing probate schedules and filing timelines. Even in the presence of his mother's body, he was a judge first and a son never. Beside him stood Julian. 33 years old, dressed in a bespoke charcoal suit even at dawn, his arm looped around my father's shoulder like a running mate. They looked like a wall. A fortress designed to keep the world out, and to keep me in my place. I stood at the far end of the hallway, clutching a paper cup of coffee. I didn't go to them. I knew better. In this family, grief was a hierarchy, and I was at the bottom of the ladder. I remembered the last time I had seen Grandma Beatrice. It was 2 weeks prior, in her sunroom. She had gripped my wrist with a strength that shocked me, her blue eyes sharp and terrifyingly clear. "Elara," she had said, her voice a low rasp that didn't reach the ears of the nurses. "They think I've forgotten. They think I'm just a house they're waiting to inherit. But you listen to me. I've taken care of the blueprints. You trust the architect, okay? You trust me." I had nodded, thinking she was drifting into the fog of her final days. I hadn't understood. Not yet. The funeral was held 3 days later in a church made of Maine granite. The air was heavy with the scent of lilies and damp wool. My father gave the eulogy. He spoke for 12 minutes. He spoke about the Vance legacy and the tradition of excellence. He mentioned Julian by name 5 times. He mentioned my mother once. He did not mention me at all. I sat there, my spine hitting the hard wood, feeling the familiar burn of invisibility. After the service, a man I didn't recognize stepped out of the crowd. He was older, with silver hair and wire-rimmed glasses. He took my hand, his grip firm and dry. "Your grandmother was very proud of the Thorn Island design you did for her," he said quietly. "She told me you were the only one who understood the foundation." "Thank you," I stammered. "Who are you?" He didn't answer. He just tapped a silver signet ring against the back of my hand. "I'll be in touch, Elara." When the noise dies down. And then he was gone. I didn't know his name then, but I would come to know it very well. His name was Arthur Sterling, and he was holding the keys to a kingdom my father thought he already ruled. That evening, the family gathered at the rookery for what my father called a legacy dinner. After a death, the Vances sat around the 100-year-old oak table and discussed the distribution of assets. It was efficient. It was cold. The rookery was a white colonial mansion on a cliff overlooking the Atlantic. It was a beautiful house, but to me, it always felt like a cage with expensive bars. My grandmother had bought it in 1981, and my father had lived there his entire adult life, treating it as his personal fiefdom. The sterling silver was polished to a mirror shine. My father sat at the head of the table, his silhouette framed by the Waterford crystal chandelier. "Mom left everything to me to manage," he announced before the soup was even served. He just stated it as a fact of nature. "Julian, we'll move the investment portfolios under your firm's umbrella. Linda, you'll continue as mistress of the house." His eyes drifted to me. They didn't linger. "And Elara, you don't need to worry about the complexities of probate. We'll make sure your rent is covered for the next year." You just focus on your gardens. The condescension was thick. Dad, I said, my voice trembling slightly. Grandma told me there were blueprints. She said she'd taken care of things. Julian let out a short, sharp laugh. Elara, Grandma was 87 and on heavy medication. She probably meant she'd pre-ordered her garden mulch. Let the adults handle the legalities. My mother stared at her plate. Silence. Always the silence. After dinner, I couldn't breathe in that house. I went upstairs to my childhood bedroom. It was preserved like a museum of a girl who no longer existed. Out of habit, I reached out and opened the nightstand drawer. It had been empty for years. But tonight, there was something inside. It was a cream-colored envelope. My name was written on the front in blue ink. It was my grandmother's handwriting, shaky, deliberate, and unmistakable. Inside were two things. The first was a letter. The second was a photocopy of a legal document. I scanned the header. My breath hitched. It read, Irrevocable Trust Agreement. Beatrice M. Vance, Settler. Beneficiary, Elara Vance. I turned to the letter. Elara, if you're reading this, then I'm gone, and Silas is already doing what I knew he would do. He doesn't hear women, Elara. He only hears documents. The originals are with my attorney, Arthur Sterling. Do not show this to Silas. Do not show this to Julian. And for heaven's sake, do not show this to your mother, or she will tell him before the sun sets. You are an architect, Elara. You know that a house is only as strong as its foundation. I have spent 10 years building a foundation for you that Silas cannot tear down. Wait for the signal. I folded the letter and pressed it against my chest. I looked at the partial document again. It mentioned a property I'd forgotten existed, Thorn Island Cottage. A small cedar house on a private spit of land 3 hours north. But as I looked closer at the legal jargon, my blood went cold. The trust wasn't just for the cottage. It was for the very ground I was standing on. I heard footsteps in the hallway. My father. I shoved the envelope under my pillow just as the door handle turned. Still hiding in the dark, Elara, he asked, his voice dripping with mock sympathy. You should come back down. Julian is explaining the new tax implications of your allowance. I looked at him, really looked at him, and for the first time, I wasn't afraid. I was looking at a man who didn't know he was standing on a fault line. I'll be down in a minute, Dad, I said. He nodded and closed the door. I waited until I heard his boots hit the bottom of the stairs before I pulled the envelope back out. I needed to see Arthur Sterling. But as I reached for my phone, a notification popped up. It was an email. Not from Sterling. It was an accidental forward from Julian's office account, intended for my father. The subject line read, Vance Estate, filing for total conservatorship. I clicked it open, and the first 3 words made the room spin. She won't fight. The email was a cold digital autopsy of my life. My own brother had drafted it with the clinical detachment of a corporate merger. He cited my unstable career path, my history of emotional impulsivity, and my failure to complete a JD as evidence of cognitive flight. They weren't just planning to take my money, they were planning to take my personhood. The allowance my father mentioned wasn't a gift. It was the bars of a cage they were already bolting shut. I didn't reply. I didn't scream. I just hit print, watched the paper slide out with a mechanical hum, and tucked it into the folder with my grandmother's letter. I left the rookery at 2 a.m., driving through a thick Maine fog. I didn't go back to my studio. I went to a 24-hour diner, ordered a coffee I didn't touch, and waited for the sun to hit the silver signet ring of the man from the funeral. At 9:01 a.m. I stood in front of a modest brick building in Portland's Old Port. A small, frosted glass door read, Arthur Sterling, Estates and Trusts. The air inside smelled of old paper and salt. Arthur sat behind a desk piled with legal volumes. He didn't look surprised. He just gestured to the leather chair and said, "You found the envelope." "I found it," I said, my voice sounding like gravel. "But I need the rest. I need to know why my father thinks he can put me in a cage." Arthur leaned back, his wire-rimmed glasses catching the light. "Your father is a judge, Elara. He is used to being the final word. But your grandmother was the silence before the storm. She hired me 10 years ago. She knew exactly who Silas was, and she knew what he would try the moment her heart stopped beating." He opened a heavy portfolio and slid a document across the desk. This was the original, thick vellum with a blood-red notary seal. "This is an irrevocable trust," Arthur explained. "In the legal world, it is a mountain. It cannot be moved. And as long as the beneficiary is competent, it cannot be touched by the trustee." I looked at the number. My vision blurred. $620,000 in a managed fund. But that wasn't the anchor. "Look at Section 4, Paragraph B," Arthur whispered. I read the lines 3 times. The Thorn Island cottage wasn't just a vacation home. It was part of a larger deed that included the cliffs, the harbor, and... My heart stopped, the primary deed to the rookery itself. My grandmother hadn't just left me a house. She had left me the ground my father was currently standing on. "He doesn't know," I breathed. "Silas never read the full document," Arthur said with a dry smile. "He saw he was named trustee and assumed his authority was absolute. He assumed the property would revert to him. He didn't realize that in an irrevocable trust, the title transfers to the beneficiary the moment the settler passes. Elara, you are the landlord of the Vance family estate. For 29 years, I had been the girl who asked for permission to breathe. All the while, my grandmother had been building a fortress beneath my feet." "He's filing for conservatorship," I told Arthur, sliding the email across the desk. "Julian is drafting the petition now. They're going to tell a court I'm unstable to void the trust." Arthur's jaw tightened. "They're committing fraud. Silas is claiming he can't locate you for consent while you're living in his own city. If he files this, he's breaking the law." He looked at me, his eyes hard. "You have 2 choices. You can run to Thorn Island and let them fight you in court for years. Or, you can give them exactly what they want." "What do they want?" "An audience," Arthur said. "They want the family together for Thanksgiving. They want to perform the legacy for the cousins. They want you small and silent at the end of the table." He tapped the red seal. "I suggest we give them the performance of a lifetime. But you have to go back. You have to let them think they've won." The drive back to the coast for Thanksgiving felt like a descent into a fever dream. I had my mask on, the one my father preferred. I wore an oversized sweater, kept my hair unbrushed, and carried myself with a defeated posture. I needed them to see a struggling artist broken by the world. When I pulled up the drive, the house looked different. It didn't look like a castle, it looked like a structural liability. I knew the deed now. I knew where my father's authority evaporated. Julian met me at the door wearing an apron over his dress shirt. "Elara," he said, dripping with toxic pity. "Glad you could make it. Dad was worried you'd had another episode." "I'm fine, Julian," I murmured, staring at my boots. "Good. Put your bags in your old room. And Elara? Try to stay out of the way. Dad is in a very specific mood about the estate announcement." I walked up the stairs, my hand trailing on the mahogany banister. The house was alive with the hum of judges and senators, the Vance circle. They were coming to witness the coronation of Julian and the sidelining of the creative soul. I locked my bedroom door and pulled out the manila folder. I didn't look at the documents. I went to the window and looked at the garden. It was dying. My grandmother's peonies were choked with weeds. My father had spent his life judging people, but he hadn't spent a single day tending to things that grow. A sharp, rhythmic rap hit the door. The judge's knock. I hid the folder under the mattress. My father stood there, perfectly pressed, a glass of 20-year-old scotch in his hand. "Tomorrow morning, I'll be reading the final distribution of your grandmother's assets," he said. "Given your recent instability, we've decided on a structure that ensures you won't have to worry about financial decisions. You should be grateful." "Grateful," I repeated. "Yes. And I expect you to be presentable. No outbursts. Just sit there and listen for once in your life." He leaned in closer, the smell of peat and smoke hitting me. "Don't embarrass me, Elara. This is the last time I'm going to bail you out." He walked away, his boots echoing like a ticking clock. He was so certain I was still the girl who had tripped in her mother's high heels. I checked my phone. A text from Arthur Sterling, "The originals are in the safe. I'll be at the gate at 10 a.m. sharp. Are you ready to remodel the family legacy?" "I'm ready," I whispered. By 9 a.m. Thanksgiving morning, the driveway was a graveyard of black sedans. The house was packed with people who only saw each other at weddings and funerals. I spent the morning in the kitchen, invisible as always. I helped the caterers and filled water glasses. Nobody asked about my design firm. I was just background noise. At 10:30 a.m., my father stood in the great hall. He tapped a silver spoon against a crystal flute, and the room went silent. "Friends, family," Silas began. "We all loved Beatrice. But we also know that in her final years, her mind wasn't what it once was. As executor of her estate, it is my duty to ensure her assets are handled with discipline." He held up a single sheet of paper. It looked legal, but I knew it was a fiction he had written himself. "The Thorn Island property and the primary liquid assets will be consolidated into a master trust managed by Julian Vance," he announced. A murmur of approval rippled through the room. "As for Elara," my father said, finding me at the back of the room, "she will receive a modest stipend, managed by her brother, to ensure her basic needs are met. It is a plan of compassion." A few people clapped. My mother wiped a tear, relief that the problem of me had been solved. "Any questions?" Silas asked, booming with confidence. "Actually, I have one," I said. In that room of high-powered silence, my voice sounded like a gunshot. My father's smile curdled. "Elara," he warned. "Don't make a scene." "I'm not, Dad," I said, stepping into the center of the room. I pulled the manila folder from my bag. "I just noticed that the document you're holding doesn't match the one Grandma Beatrice filed with the state 10 years ago." Julian stepped forward, face flushed. "Elara, get out of here. You're having a breakdown." "Dad, I'll take her upstairs." "Stay where you are, Julian," I said in my architect voice. I turned back to my father. "You told the court 3 weeks ago that you couldn't locate the beneficiary of the trust. You claimed I was unreachable so you could file for a change in status." The room went cold. Silas's eyes darted to the door. "I don't know what you're talking about." "I'm not confused," I said, holding up the printed email Julian had accidentally sent me. "And neither is the man currently standing on your front porch." The heavy oak door opened. Arthur Sterling walked in, carrying a briefcase that seemed to radiate a cold, legal gravity. "My name is Arthur Sterling," he announced. "I am here to read the actual last will and testament of Beatrice Vance. I suggest everyone stay seated, because the ownership of this house is about to change." My father's glass slipped from his hand. Red wine splashed across his polished boots like a puddle of blood. For the first time, I didn't see the judge. I saw a man who realized the blueprints had been changed while he was sleeping. The silence that followed Arthur Sterling's announcement was heavy, the kind of pressurized air that precedes a structural collapse. My father didn't move. He stood in front of the hearth, the fire casting jagged shadows across his face, making him look like a monument carved from salt. 30 of Maine's most powerful people were frozen, mid-sip and mid-breath, their eyes darting between the silver-haired attorney and the judge who had suddenly lost his footing. "Arthur, you're overstepping," my father finally said, his voice regaining its judicial steel, though it was an octave thinner than before. "This is a private family matter. I'll have you removed for trespassing." "You could try, Silas," Arthur replied, unclasping his briefcase with a crisp, metallic click. "But it's difficult to trespass on a property when you are invited by the legal owner. And as of 6:14 a.m. the Tuesday Beatrice passed, that owner is Elara Vance." A collective gasp swept through the room. My Aunt Margaret dropped her plate, the porcelain shattered on the hardwood, a sharp punctuation mark to the revelation. Julian took a step toward me, his hands raised in a placating gesture that felt like a threat. "Elara, honey, you're being manipulated," Julian said, his voice dripping with that toxic golden sun concern. "Sterling is a bottom feeder. He's filling your head with fantasies because he knows you're vulnerable. Dad has handled everything to protect you." I didn't look at Julian. I didn't even acknowledge the brother who had spent the last decade treating me like a draft he intended to delete. I looked at the garden outside the window, the dying, gray patch of earth that Beatrice had loved. "The blueprints don't lie, Julian," I said, my voice steady. "And neither does the deed." Arthur pulled a document from his case, the original vellum with the gold leaf seal of the state. He didn't read it like a poem, he read it like a sentence. He detailed the irrevocable trust, the specific coordinates of the rookery, and the clause Beatrice had inserted in 2016, upon the settler's death, the title of the primary estate shall not pass to the son, but shall vest immediately and entirely in the granddaughter, Elara. My father's hand found the mantle, his knuckles turning bone-white. He looked around the room and saw his jury, the people he had spent years impressing, slowly leaning away from him. The power in the room was shifting, flowing toward the back of the hall where I stood with a man who held the truth in a leather bag. The Thanksgiving dinner had officially curdled into a deposition. My father attempted one last escalation. He straightened his tie, puffed his chest, and pointed a trembling finger at the door. "Everyone, please," Silas boomed, his voice cracking. "My daughter is clearly unwell. Arthur is exploiting her grief. I am the trustee. I have administrative authority over this house." "Administrative authority is not ownership, Silas," Arthur countered, stepping into the center of the room. "And that authority is predicated on your duty to the beneficiary, a duty you breached the moment you filed a fraudulent petition claiming Elara was missing while she was sitting at your dinner table." Arthur held up a second stack of papers, the printed email chain I had found. The guests nearest to him leaned in. They saw the timestamps. They saw Julian's firm's header. They saw the words, "She won't fight. She never fights anything." I watched the realization hit my mother. She was sitting in the wingback chair, her face pale. She looked at Julian, then at Silas, and for the first time in 30 years, she didn't look at them with deference. She looked at them with horror. She realized her son and husband hadn't been protecting the family, they had been hunting one of its members. "Is it true?" my mother whispered. "Silas? Did you try to declare her incompetent?" My father didn't answer. He couldn't. The evidence was literally hanging in the air. "I didn't just come to read the will, Silas," Arthur said, his tone turning clinical. "I'm here to serve you. Elara has authorized me to file for your immediate removal as trustee for breach of fiduciary duty. And as the owner of this property, she is formally requesting that you and Julian vacate the premises by the end of the weekend." The room went from pressurized silence to a dull roar of whispers. The Vance United Front had been demolished. Julian sank into a chair, his head in his hands, the golden sun finally tarnished. My father simply sat down at the head of the table and stared at his empty wine glass. He looked small. For the first time in my life, the judge looked like a man who had been overruled by a higher court. By 2 p.m., the black sedans were gone. The elite had fled the rookery as if the house were on fire, leaving half-eaten plates and untouched wine in their wake. The great hall was empty, save for the scent of wood smoke and the lingering tension of a dynasty's collapse. I walked through the house alone. I touched the crown molding Grandma Beatrice had chosen in the 80s. I walked through the kitchen where I had chopped herbs in the shadows. It felt different now. The air didn't feel heavy, it felt like it was finally circulating. I went out to the garden. The frost was biting, but the air was clear. I knelt by the birdbath, digging my fingers into the cold, damp soil. Beatrice had told me to trust the architect. She had known that I would need a foundation of my own before I could ever build anything for the rest of the world. I felt a presence behind me. I didn't have to turn around to know it was my mother. She stood there, her coat wrapped tight against the wind. "I didn't know, Elara," she said, her voice trembling. I stayed quiet because I thought it kept the peace. I didn't realize the peace was a lie. "Silence isn't peace, Mom," I said, standing up and wiping the dirt from my hands. "It's just an absence of noise. There's a difference." She looked at the house. The massive white colonial that had been her world for 3 decades. "What are you going to do with it?" "I'm going to remodel," I said. "I'm going to tear down the walls that keep the light out. And I'm going to start with the garden." I reached into my pocket and pulled out the brass key Arthur had given me. It felt heavy. It felt real. But as I turned toward the house, I saw a car idling at the end of the driveway, a local sheriff's cruiser. My heart hammered against my ribs. Arthur was supposed to handle the filings tomorrow. Why was the law here now? I walked toward the gate, my mother trailing behind me. The officer stepped out of the car. He wasn't holding a summons or an eviction notice. He was holding a small, weathered wooden box. "Miss Vance," the officer asked. "We were instructed to deliver this to the owner of Thorn Island upon the filing of the death certificate. Your grandmother wanted you to have this the moment the house was yours." I took the box. It smelled like cedar and salt air. My hands shook as I lifted the lid. Inside wasn't a document or a key. It was a second signet ring, identical to Arthur's, and a handwritten note on a scrap of yellowed paper. I read the words, and the breath left my lungs in a sharp gasp. "The house is the beginning, Elara. The basement is the end. Check the furnace room. Look for the blue brick. The blue brick." The words on the yellowed paper felt like a physical weight. My grandmother hadn't just secured my future, she had left a trail. I stood in the driveway of the rookery as the sheriff's cruiser pulled away into the Maine mist and felt the house transform. It was no longer just a piece of real estate. It was a vault. I didn't wait for my mother to follow. I walked back through the great hall, past the shattered porcelain and the spilled wine staining the floor my father no longer owned. I headed for the basement door. A heavy oak slab tucked behind the kitchen that I hadn't opened since I was 10 years old. The stairs creaked with a hollow groan. The air down here didn't smell like wood polish or perfume, it smelled of damp earth and time. I reached the bottom and flicked the switch. A single, dusty bulb buzzed into life, casting skeletal shadows across the stone foundation. The furnace, a hulking iron beast, hissed and clanked in the corner. I knelt on the cold concrete, my fingers tracing the rough foundation wall. Most of the bricks were the color of dried blood, but there, tucked behind a rusted copper pipe, was a single block of slate blue stone. It wasn't mortar holding it in place. It was wax. I pulled a screwdriver from a nearby workbench and pried at the edges. The blue brick slid out with a grinding sound, revealing a hollow cavity. Inside was a small, waterproof case. No legal vellum this time. Just a flash drive and a stack of Polaroids held together by a thick rubber band. I sat on the cold floor and flipped through the photos. They weren't of gardens. They were of ledger entries from 30 years ago, bank transfers and shell companies. In the center of every photo was my father's signature, not as a judge, but as a young attorney moving money that didn't belong to him. My heart hammered against my ribs. Beatrice hadn't just protected me from Silas. She had been holding a sword over his head for 3 decades. This was the reason he was so desperate to declare her incompetent. He wasn't just chasing an inheritance. He was trying to bury the evidence of how he built his empire. I climbed the stairs, the case clutched to my chest, and walked straight into the judge's study. The room was dark, lit only by the embers in the fireplace. My father sat in his leather wingback chair. He didn't look up. He looked like a man waiting for a storm to pass. "You should be packing, Silas," I said. My voice was quiet, but it filled the room. "I've lived in this house for 35 years, Elara," he whispered, his voice thick with fragility. "You can't just throw a man out because of a piece of paper." "It's not just the paper," I said, stepping into the firelight. I tossed the stack of Polaroids onto the mahogany desk. They slid across the polished wood like dealt cards. He looked down. I watched the moment the blood left his face. It wasn't a fade, it was an erasure. He reached out, his hand trembling, and touched a photo of a transfer dated June 12, 1994. "She kept them," he breathed. It was the realization of a lifelong defeat. "She kept everything," I said. "She knew that one day, your greed would outgrow your fear. She knew you'd try to erase me the way you tried to erase the people you stole from." I leaned over the desk, forcing him to look at me. "Julian knows, doesn't he? That's why he's so desperate to keep the united front. He's protecting the firm, not you." Silas closed his eyes. The judge was gone. In his place was a tired man who had spent 30 years building a house on a foundation of lies. "What do you want, Elara? Money? Isn't the house enough?" "I don't want your money, Silas. I have my own now. I want the truth. You're going to walk out of that door, take Julian with you, and never mention the Vance name as a badge of honor again. You're going to resign. Quietly. For health reasons. And if I don't? Then I take this box to the district attorney. And we see how the bench feels about one of their own being a common thief." The silence that followed was absolute. Finally, Silas stood up. He walked to the window and looked out at the dark Atlantic, crashing against the cliffs of a property he no longer owned. "I always thought you were the weak one," he said, his back to me. "I thought you were soft, like the dirt you're always digging in." "Dirt is where things grow, Silas," I replied. "Concrete just cracks." The next morning, the house was silent. Julian had left in the middle of the night, his golden boy aura extinguished by the reality of a disbarment threat. My mother was upstairs, packing a single suitcase. She had decided to stay with Aunt Margaret. She wasn't ready to talk yet, but for the first time, she hadn't asked Silas for permission to leave. I stood on the front porch as my father walked toward his SUV. He was carrying a small box of personal items, his law books and a few framed photos. He paused at the top of the steps and looked at the house. "It's a lot of maintenance, Elara," he said, his voice flat. "The salt air eats the wood. You'll find out soon enough that owning a kingdom is just another way of being a slave to it." "I'm not looking for a kingdom, Silas," I said. "I'm looking for a home. There's a difference." He didn't respond. He got into the car and drove down the long, gravel drive. I watched the taillights disappear into the pines until the roar of the ocean swallowed the engine. I was alone. The rookery was mine. The house felt lighter, as if a great weight had been lifted from its rafters. I went to the kitchen, made a pot of coffee, and sat at the oak table where I had chopped herbs in silence just 24 hours ago. I pulled out my phone and called Arthur Sterling. "It's done," I said. "He's gone." "And the box?" Arthur asked. "Safe. For now. It stays in the blue brick until I decide if the world needs to see it. But Arthur, I need you to do one more thing for me. Anything, Elara. I need a landscape crew. The best in New England. I want them here by Monday. We're going to start with the peonies. Tell them to bring plenty of soil. The good kind. We're going to need a fresh start. I hung up and walked to the window. The sun was finally breaking through the fog, turning the gray Atlantic into hammered silver. My name is Elara Vance, and for 29 years, I had been a ghost in my own life. But as I looked at the garden, I realized the silence was finally over. I didn't need to earn my seat at the table anymore. I had built the house. For the first time in my life, the only voice I could hear was my own. The great hall of the rookery had never felt so vast, or so cold. My father stood by the fireplace, the light of the dying embers casting him as a fallen king. He was still clutching that single, fraudulent sheet of paper, the one that said I was worth $5,000 and a lifetime of supervision. Arthur, leave, Silas commanded, though the gravel in his voice had turned to sand. This is a family matter. Elara is having a crisis. She's always been fragile. I'm not the one who's breaking, Dad, I said. I stepped into the center of the room, the manila folder held tight against my chest. Arthur Sterling didn't flinch. He stepped up to the long oak dining table, the one where I had been seated at the kids' table just hours before, and laid out the thick, cream-colored vellum of the original trust. The red notary seal sat on the wood like a drop of wet paint. The document my father is holding is a fabrication, I addressed the room. My voice didn't shake. He filed a petition 3 weeks ago claiming I was missing, all while I was answering his phone calls and sleeping in this house. He did it to bypass an irrevocable clause. I looked at Aunt Margaret, then at the cousins, and finally at my mother. Grandma Eleanor didn't leave a distribution plan. She left a fortress. Arthur began to read. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried the surgical precision of a man who had spent 40 years choosing his words. He read the clause that named me the sole beneficiary of the $620,000 fund. But he didn't stop there. Furthermore, Arthur continued, his eyes shifting to Silas, as per the specific instructions of Eleanor Brennan, the real property known as 4714 Hawthorne Street, this house is not, and has never been, part of the residual estate. It was purchased with her separate inheritance in 1981. It is a non-marital asset. He slid a deed across the table. It was recorded, notarized, and undeniable. The title transfers immediately to the named beneficiary, Victoria Torrey Brennan. The room inhaled as one, a collective, sharp gasp that seemed to suck the oxygen right out of the rafters. My father's hand dropped from the mantel. He looked at the deed as if it were a snake coiled on the table. He hadn't just lost the money. He had lost the ground he was standing on. The big reveal wasn't that I was rich. It was that the man who had spent 30 years grounding me was, as of this moment, a guest in my home. For a second, Silas tried to rebuild the facade. He straightened his tie, his fingers fumbling with the silk. This is absurd. My mother was in cognitive decline. She didn't know. She scored in the 93rd percentile on her last evaluation. Silas, Arthur cut him off, dropping a medical report on top of the deed. She was sharper than anyone in this room. Especially you. That was the moment the mask didn't just slip, it shattered. My father turned on Julian. The golden sun was sitting frozen, his laptop still open on his knees, his face the color of wet ash. Say something. Silas roared, his judicial baritone cracking into a desperate shriek. You're the lawyer. Contest it. You told me she'd never find out. You said she was too passive to fight. The room went tomb quiet. In his panic, Silas had just confessed to the conspiracy in front of 30 witnesses. Julian didn't look up. He slowly closed his laptop, the click sounding like a guillotine. Dad, he whispered, irrevocable means irrevocable. I told you we needed her consent. You told me to handle the paperwork. I can't fix this. No one can. My mother stood up then. There were no tears in her eyes, only a cold, hard clarity that I hadn't seen in 29 years. She walked over to the table, picked up the email chain Arthur had printed, the one where Julian called me too weak to fight, and handed it to Silas. You owe her an apology, Richard, she said, her voice thin but unbreakable. You've owed her one her entire life. My father looked at the paper, then at the room full of relatives looking at him with a mixture of pity and disgust. His audience had become his jury. He realized then that he hadn't just lost the house. He had lost the legend of Richard Brennan. Without a word, he turned and walked into his study, slamming the mahogany door behind him. The sound echoed through the house, a final, hollow thud of a man shutting himself into a kingdom that no longer existed. 6 months later, the Maine spring had finally arrived. I was on my knees in the garden of the Hawthorne house, my house. The air smelled of damp earth and salt, the particular fragrance of things deciding to grow again. I was transplanting peonies, the same ones Grandma Eleanor loved because they were pink and lasted longer than anyone expected. The transition hadn't been easy. There were court filings, a 6-month suspension for Julian's law license, and a mountain of legacy to dismantle. Silas had moved into a luxury apartment across town, still telling anyone who would listen that he was the victim of a grand manipulation. Some things are truly irrevocable. But the house felt different now. The heavy velvet curtains were gone, replaced by light linen that let the Atlantic sun flood the great hall. The study, once a dark room of judgment, was now my drafting studio, filled with soil samples, blueprints, and the Frank Lloyd Wright poster I'd finally framed. My mother was there that morning, helping me clear the weeds from the stone path. We didn't talk much, but the silence was different now. It wasn't a silence of fear, it was a silence of work. You're doing it right, she said, watching me press the soil down around the roots. The way she taught you. The whole root ball, Mom, I said, wiping the dirt from my forehead. You don't leave any part of yourself behind. I stood up and looked at the house. The white colonial stood tall against the blue Maine sky. I wasn't the girl sitting at the kids' table anymore. I wasn't the creative soul who needed an allowance. I was the architect of my own life. I walked toward the porch, the brass key heavy and warm in my pocket. As I reached the door, I looked back at the garden. The peonies were holding. The foundation was firm. And for the first time in 29 years, when I stepped across the threshold, I wasn't entering a cage. I was finally coming home.
Thank you for watching. Subscribe Family Files for more.